Welcome back to Intro to Philosophy 1010. Here's our book, The World of Philosophy, an Introductory Reader by Stephen Kahn. And in this video, we're going over Rene Descartes, John Locke, and Gottfried Leibniz. So, as you'll see, the readings for Descartes and Leibniz is pretty short. For Descartes, it's page 62 to 65, but it's really only about 2.5 pages. And then for Leibniz, it's pages 71 to 72. It's really only about 1 page. So we're also going to be including, for the Descartes reading, the second meditation, which starts on page 100. So this is because we've got a new book this semester, and this exam asks, and you'll understand why I'm adding that extra reading from Descartes, because here it is for exam 2. We'll be going over question part A. What are the similarities? Part A, question 1. What are the similarities and differences between the rationalist views of knowledge put forth by Descartes and Leibniz? Which position is better argued, why, and explain? Well, there's not really enough reading material in this part of our book to answer that question about the rationalist views of Descartes. So I'm saying if you're going to answer this question, read page 62 to 65, and it's really mostly on page 63 and 64, and then go over and read page 100 to, I believe it is 105. Yeah. And that will give you Descartes a much better taste of Descartes' rationalism. And we're also going over John Locke in this essay, because the very short reading by Leibniz, half of that is a critique of John Locke, who is an empiricist. And so we'll also be covering part B, question 6, explain Leibniz's criticisms of Locke. And since we'll be going over John Locke, that means we'll also be going over the first 5 questions for part B. Number 1, what is empiricism? Number 2, what is rationalism? I'll be touching on number 3, what is idealism? That has more to do with Berkeley. Number 4, what is skepticism? So that will be addressed with John Locke. And then number 5, explain Locke's tabula rasa idea. Okay, so empiricism and rationalism. This part of our book is about knowledge. What can I know? Part 3 of the book, Epistemology, the study of what can be known. So the 2 main schools in epistemology are the rationalists and the empiricists. Rationalists say we have knowledge imprinted on our souls, and that reason can discern this knowledge. Empiricists say that knowledge comes from our sense perceptions of the outer world. Or at any rate, there's different versions of empiricism, but the one thing they agree on is knowledge comes from sense perceptions. What causes sense perceptions, there's disagreement about that, but the overall definition is rationalism believes that there are some ideas imprinted on the soul, innate to the human being, imprinted on the human mind, that we don't require, that all of our knowledge need not come from sense impressions. Whereas empiricism says that knowledge comes from sense impressions. And it's not as clear-cut as that, because, as we'll see, even John Locke says there are certain innate forms of knowledge of the self and knowledge of God, which is what Descartes says. So it gets confusing. In this introductory class, it's enough if you read the material, explain the basic ideas of these philosophers, and back up your opinions with short, pertinent quotes with the page number. So I'll just be going over general overview of what they each say, and then include some pertinent quotes, and we'll just keep it moving like that. So what are the similarities and differences between the rationalist views of knowledge put forth by Descartes and Leibniz? Okay, so Descartes' rationalism, and another thing which I don't agree with in this book, is that the study of knowledge and rationalism, they just skip right to Rene Descartes. Well, they didn't touch on the ultimate rationalist, Plato. We read Plato's Apology and the Phaedo and the Crito, but none of those parts of those dialogues. In the Phaedo, Plato goes over his theory, these absolute ideas imprinted on the soul. That's rationalism. And we'll see Leibniz refer to Plato, but we haven't read that in the book, so I'm not expecting you to know about that yet. We do start to talk about that when we discuss Plato's cave allegory, but it would have been, I think, helpful to include Plato in this section of the book. But at any rate, we start with Descartes. And what's unique about Rene Descartes' rationalism is he starts it off, his rational critique of knowledge, what can a human being know, with doubting everything, total skepticism. He doubts as much as he possibly can. So I'll read a little bit here on page 62. And remember, we're going to also skip over to page 100. So he says, some years ago, I was struck by the large number of falsehoods that I had accepted as true in my childhood, and by the highly doubtful nature of the whole edifice that I had subsequently based on them. All right, so I believed a lot of falsehoods in my childhood. I built up a grander worldview based on those earlier beliefs. And now that I'm later in life, it seems to me I should subject everything I believe to a thorough skeptical criticism. And it's easier to just go right at the foundation of my worldview, right at the first principles. He says on page 63, once the foundations of a building are undermined, anything built on them collapses of its own accord. So I will go straight for the basic principles on which all my former beliefs rested. Then he mentions that his sense perception, so the empiricists say knowledge comes from seeing, hearing, touching, tasting, and smelling, the 5 sense organs. But Descartes will say, well, definite knowledge doesn't come from the senses. He says, from time to time I have found that the senses deceive, and it is prudent never to trust completely those who have deceived us even once. So his senses have deceived us. In a classic example from Indian philosophy is, if you see a rope coiled up in the evening when the light isn't so good, you might mistake it for a cobra. So your senses deceive you. So they can't be the absolute foundation of certain knowledge. And then ultimately he'll go on to say, there's no certain sign by means of which being awake can be distinguished from being asleep. You could be dreaming it all. We all go to sleep every night. We have dreams. During the dream, you're convinced it's real. You don't question the reality of the dream. Well, maybe that's what's happening right now. There's no certain way you could prove that you're not dreaming right now. Well, I'll pinch myself. Well, you can imagine pinching yourself in a dream and thinking it's real. All right, so now he says that, so he's doubting everything because it could all be a dream. I'm going to get into a little bit of sidetrack details that he talks about here because it's going to be helpful when we talk about John Locke. So he's like, all right, well, even if it's a dream, that doesn't mean nothing's real, because the images in our dreams are based on things that really exist. So maybe there is a reality to the outside physical world implied by the dreams. So, you know, even if we don't believe in the complicated forms that we perceive in a dream, and if we assume this material world's a dream, and that things like the human form and the other animal forms, those are fictions created by a dream, still the colors of which they're made seem to be basic. They must be real. On the bottom of page 63, it says, this class appears to include corporeal nature in general and its extension, the shape of extended things, the quantity or size and number of these things, the place in which they may exist, the time through which they may endure, and so these kind of general concepts, at least they must be real. Shape and time, and so then he's saying, all right, well, if I doubt that, then on page 64, for whether I am awake or asleep, 2 and 3 added together are 5, so at least the truths of mathematics I can trust. And then he says, but nevertheless, I've grown up believing in God, an omnipotent God. So maybe God is forcing me to think that 3 plus 2, 2 and 3 added together are 5. Every time I add it together, 2, and then add 3 more fingers, there's 5. There's really 6, but God's just forcing you to perceive 5 every time because God's omnipotent. So he's like, oh, well, then he says, well, maybe you don't want to believe in such an omnipotent God. So God's a fiction, and let's just assume that I've emerged into being from fate. So random combinations of atoms created me. He goes, well, all right, then I'm even more inclined to not believe in any certain knowledge of anything because of these imperfect chance coincidences that created me. Why would I trust that those imperfect causes could create a being capable of certain knowledge? So I don't think I can believe anything. And then he says, okay, I'm going to, and I think this is interesting. So I don't think he really doubts the existence of the material world, but what he's trying to do is find a certain truth that can't be doubted. Even if he tries his hardest to doubt something, he wants to find that at least one truth that he can't possibly doubt, no matter how hard he tries. So I'll read here. I think it's interesting on page 64. He says, but it is not enough merely to have noticed this. I must make an effort to remember it. My habitual opinions keep coming back, and despite my wishes, they capture my belief, which is as it were bound over to them as a result of long occupation and the law of custom. I shall never get out of the habit of confidently assenting to these opinions so long as I suppose them to be what in fact they are, namely highly probable opinions. He's talking about the existence of physical things outside of his mind. It's very highly probable that they do exist. He says opinions which, despite the fact that they are in a sense doubtful, as has just been shown, is still much more reasonable to believe than to deny. So he's saying, yeah, I do believe in the outside world, but there are reasons I can imagine which would lead me to believe they might be false. Very unlikely, but it's just possible that they might be fictions in a dream, or, as he's going to go on to say, fictions created by some evil genie. But what he's trying to do is train his mind. He's meditating. So like in yoga, when you bend your body into certain positions, similarly in the Indian tradition, philosophy is considered a form of yoga for the mind. Jnana yoga. You bend your mind into certain conceptual positions, and that will help you see things more truly or unleash certain psychic powers. And this is what he's explaining, what he's trying to do. He says, in view of this, I think it will be a good plan to turn my will in completely the opposite direction and deceive myself by pretending for a time that these former opinions are utterly false and imaginary. I shall do this until the weight of preconceived opinion is counterbalanced and the distorting influence of habit no longer prevents my judgments from perceiving things correctly. Okay, so he's bent towards believing just what you see is what you get his whole life. Yeah, this is a real material world. The things I perceive through my senses are real. So to counteract that lifetime of habit, he's going to force himself to believe exactly the opposite. And by that kind of contrary movement of the mind, come to a more balanced worldview. So in this extreme counterbalancing positions, he says on 64 in the right-hand column, I will suppose, therefore, that not God, who is supremely good and the source of truth, but rather some malicious demon of the utmost power and cunning has employed all his energies in order to deceive me. So everything he experiences, his body, is some powerful demon forcing him to believe he has a body. He doesn't have a body. His sense perceptions cannot be trusted. His thoughts of mathematics can't be trusted. So is there anything, and this is why you're going to see why we're going to skip over to page 100. If you assume some evil demon, some omnipotent demon has this power, is there anything in that ultimate skeptical position where you can't trust anything? Is there anything you can trust? Is there any truth that a human mind can achieve? So they cut it off on page 65, so it's a kind of a cliffhanger. So we're now going over to page 100. And so picking up, this is the second meditation. So he's saying, yes, there is something I can know for sure, and that's that I exist because I think. Even if this demon is making me imagine everything about my body and the world that I live in and mathematical truths, even if everything I perceive is imaginary, the simple fact that I'm doubting the truth of what I perceive proves one thing, and that is that I exist, says Descartes. I think, therefore I am. His famous line. Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. I can be certain that I exist as a thinking thing. I can't be certain that I have a body. Could be a dream, could be an evil demon forcing me to imagine I have a body. But even if that is the case, I can't think that I don't exist, because even the act of doubting that I exist proves that I do exist. That's his ultimate point. So he's a rationalist. What can I know for certain? One thing, at least, I know for certain, and that's that I exist as a thinking being. And however many times I doubt the truth of that, I thereby prove its truth. For doubting is a form of thinking, and thinking is a form of being. I think, therefore I am. So on page 102, up at on the left-hand column, up at the top, I'll be skipping through here. But what shall I now say that I am, when I am supposing that there's some supremely powerful and, if it is permissible to say so, malicious deceiver who is deliberately trying to trick me in every way he can? Can I now assert that I possess even the most insignificant of all the attributes which I have just said belong to the nature of the body? No. I can't believe I have a body. What about sense perception? Can't trust that, because that comes from the body, and that could be the delusion of an evil demon creating this hallucination. And he says, at last I have discovered it. Thought, this alone is inseparable from me. I am, I exist. That is certain. But for how long? For as long as I am thinking. For it could be that were I totally to cease from thinking, I should totally cease to exist. At present, I am not admitting anything except what is necessarily true. I am, then, in the strict sense, only a thing that thinks. That is, I am a mind, or intelligence, or intellect, or reason, words whose meaning I have been ignorant of until now, a thinking thing. So that's the next exam will be about the mind-body problem and what is a self. And the questions for that, for exam 3, are a lot more general. Descartes will be included in part A for exam 3. Which of the views on the relation of mind and body, part 4A, do you think presents the best argument? Why explain? So I'll be posting this video again for exam 3. If you answer this question for exam 2, part A question 1, well then you could do it again and mention Descartes in exam 3. So if you want to go down that path, it won't be, you can get credit for 2 exams for reading this, Meditations on First Philosophy. Okay, so that is what Rene Descartes believes, that I am a thinking thing. And then I'll very briefly now go over his example of wax, a piece of wax. What can I really know? And his point is, you don't really have knowledge through your sense perceptions of things, which the empiricists will say that is your source of knowledge. And he'll say, for example, look at this piece of wax. This is page 103 at the bottom of the left-hand column. He goes, it has just been taken from the honeycomb. It has not yet quite lost the taste of the honey. It retains some of the scent of the flowers from which it was gathered. Its color, shape, and size are plain to see. It is hard, cold, and can be handled without difficulty. He can tap on it. It makes a sound. It has the smell. Then he puts it near a fire. The smell goes away. The color changes. The shape is lost. The size increases. It becomes liquid and hot. Everything's changed now. All of the sense perceptions of this piece of wax have now suddenly changed because he's added the element of heat. So what was it that he ever understood? On the right-hand column, 103. But what exactly is it that I'm now imagining? Let us concentrate, take away everything which does not belong to the wax, and see what is left. Merely something extended, flexible, and changeable. This is going to be touching on the idea of the primary and secondary qualities that John Locke focuses on. This is what Descartes, he brought up the same idea. Okay, so the things that I smell and the color and all of that, they've changed. Well, what's left? Something extended, flexible, and changeable. Okay, these are the primary qualities that adhere to the wax itself and not the sensory perceptions it induces in the human mind. But it's infinitely flexible, it's infinitely extendable. You can twist it into an infinite number of shapes, and you can imagine, well, you can start to imagine extending it towards infinity, but he'll go on to say imagination can't encompass infinity. So even your imagination doesn't understand the wax for what it really is. Your senses don't really understand it, he's saying. Your imagination can't conceive it because it can be extended to infinity and twisted into an infinite number of shapes. So how do you really have knowledge of the wax? Through your reason, through your understanding. On page 104 at the top, I must therefore admit that the nature of this piece of wax is in no way revealed by my imagination, but is perceived by the mind alone. Skipping down a little, he says, and yet, and here's the point, the perception I have of it is a case not of vision or touch or imagination, nor has it ever been, despite previous appearances, but of purely mental scrutiny. And this can be imperfect and confused as it was before, or clear and distinct as it is now, depending on how carefully I concentrate on what the wax consists in. He at the bottom of the left-hand column, he says that it is in fact grasped solely by the faculty of judgment, which is in my mind. It is the intellect alone that really understands anything. So, that is what the rationalists say. Now we're going to see John Locke, his empiricist argument, and then we'll see Leibniz counteracting Locke very briefly, and then we'll go back to these exam questions. Okay, so John Locke. And now what makes this also a little more difficult is that well, we didn't see in the short selections that we've read of Descartes how he brings in another idea that we also have an innate idea of God, and that our idea of God is of a perfect being. And because God is a perfect being, there must be a real God who caused that idea in our mind, because everything has to have a cause, says Descartes, and the only thing that could cause the idea of infinite perfection is something truly infinitely perfect, which is God. And then if God is perfect, God's not a deceiver, so we can trust that the correlation between the mathematical ideas we have, which provide certain knowledge, and the activities of the material world, the fact that they do seem to correlate, and you can apply mathematical principles to an examination of the material world, you can trust that correlation as a sound source of knowledge because it comes from a trustworthy God. As a matter of fact, you know what? I want to get here. This book, The Passion of the Western Mind, by Richard Tarnas. So I read this book in 1993, my senior year of college. It was a great capstone for my major in philosophy, and I just wanted to read a little bit. Before I go to John Locke, just read a little bit here from Richard Tarnas about Rene Descartes. He goes, if it was Bacon in England who helped inspire the distinctive character, direction, and vigor of the new science, it was Descartes on the continent who established its philosophical foundation, and in so doing articulated the epochal defining statement of the modern self. All right, so Descartes had come after the revolution in astronomy, the Copernican revolution, which undermined the authority of the Catholic Church. and the worldview of the medieval mind was now thrown into doubt. So Rene Descartes, educated by the Jesuits, the Catholic order of priests, he was trying to search out where could you find absolute certain knowledge if you can't appeal to divine revelation. If people don't trust the authority of the Bible or the authority of the church, is there any certain knowledge that we could have? And that's what he did. He doubted everything first, and then he came to his one conclusion, that at least I know I exist. Because even if I doubt everything, the act of doubting proves my existence. So, I'll read this. This is over on page 277. Skepticism, I'll start by being totally skeptical. Skepticism and mathematics thus combined to produce the Cartesian revolution in philosophy. The third term in that revolution, that which was both the impulse behind the outcome of systematic doubt and self-evident reasoning, was to be the bedrock of all human knowledge, the certainty of individual self-awareness. For in the process of methodically doubting everything, even the apparent reality of the physical world and his own body, which could all be only a dream, Descartes concluded that there was one datum that could not be doubted, the fact of his own doubting. At least the I, who is conscious of doubting, the thinking subject, exists. At least this much is certain, cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am. All else can be questioned, but not the irreducible fact of the thinker's self-awareness. So then I'll just conclude when he says here on page 279, thus human reason establishes first its own existence out of experiential necessity, then God's existence out of logical necessity, and thence the God-guaranteed reality of the objective world and its rational order. So we, in our selection, didn't get into the idea of the self-evident existence of God, which would have helped with this question of comparing the rationalist views of Descartes and Leibniz. It seems to me in this book that the rationalists got shortchanged on their representation. There's not a lot here to defend, which is why I included the extra part from another part of the book for Descartes. Okay, so with Descartes in place, the founder of the modern mind, we are a thinking rational self separate from the body, can't even be sure the body even exists, and through skeptical rational thought we can come to a few indubitable, undoubtable truths. I think therefore I am, and then the idea of God as the perfect, honest being, and if God's perfect and honest, then the world we perceive with our senses is real, and we can correlate the mathematical forms that help us predict the physical actions of little material particles with certainty. David Hume's going to come and question that, but this is the origins of the scientific revolution here, and it starts with rationalism, but it's also powerfully influenced by empiricism, which brings us to John Locke. So I'll read here on page 65 from Stephen Kahn's introductory notes. Philosophers like Descartes, who base knowledge on reason alone rather than sense experience, are known as rationalists. Those who base knowledge on sense experience rather than pure reason are known as empiricists. And the leading historical exponents of exponents at any rate of empiricism are John Locke, George Berkeley, and David Hume. So we'll be talking about George Berkeley and David Hume in the next video, but for here we have John Locke. And so this is also going over part B for our exam 2, number 5, explain Locke's tabula rasa idea, which Leibniz brings up, and they explain Leibniz's criticisms of Locke. So we'll get to that when we get to Leibniz. But here is John Locke. All right. So he's saying, we'll just start at the beginning here on page 66. Basically what he's going to say, the tabula rasa means an empty tablet. Our mind is like an empty tablet, and then sense impressions write information on it, and then we can shuffle that information around to learn about the world, but the source of knowledge is the impressions on our sense organs made by little particles emanating from the physical objects we perceive. So this is another part of the scientific revolution based on the idea of these little itty-bitty bits of matter floating around in empty space, which exist whether you're observing them or not. We're going to see that Berkeley brings that into question, so does Hume, but it did make sense in the context of Isaac Newton's physics, which is based on the idea of little bits of matter floating in 3 dimensions of space along a linear time dimension. So for Locke, knowledge comes from sense impressions, which are caused by imperceptible particles interacting with the imperceptible particles of our sense organs. So he didn't know about photons, but he assumed there's something connecting our vision of an object and that object itself. Some little particles emanating from the object, contacting particles of our sense organs, causing us to perceive the idea of an object. So whereas we saw Descartes say that knowledge doesn't come from sense perception, you can't trust it fully, you can only trust your understanding of a thing, Locke is going to say, he's going to put a lot more faith in sense perceptions. But again, as I mentioned, let's just look here on page 69. This complicates it because he's agreeing with Descartes' basic points of rationalism. 69, the right-hand column, of our knowledge of the existence of other things. So he says, the knowledge of our own being we have by intuition. The existence of a God, reason clearly makes known to us. The knowledge of the existence of any other thing we can have only by sensation, for there being no necessary connection of real existence with any idea a man has in his memory, nor of any other existence but that of God with the existence of any... All right, so there's 2 things we can know, like the rationalists say, without sense perception, and that is the knowledge of our own being we have by intuition. The existence of a God, reason clearly makes known to us. So I know I exist, I think therefore I am, and then God exists. Well, those are the 2 things that Descartes was saying. So John Locke agrees with Descartes on that, and we didn't see Descartes talk about the rational proof for God in the selections that we had. But what Locke changes about from the rationalism of Descartes is saying that everything else but our knowledge of our own existence and the existence of God comes from sense perceptions. So they are reliable sources of knowledge. Which it doesn't even seem to me that Descartes disagreed with that much, because once he deduced the existence of a rational, trustworthy, perfect God, then Descartes also says that's why it's reasonable to trust our sense perceptions, that they do signify things that exist outside of our mind, that have extension in space, that exist whether we're observing them or not. But that's a point that Locke is going to focus on. And it seems to me he's criticizing Descartes' mental technique of imagining that everything was false. We saw Descartes say, that it's very high. It's much more reasonable to believe in the truth of the material objects we perceive, but it can be questioned, and to counteract that habit of just accepting things without questioning them that my senses perceive, I'm going to go in the opposite extreme and assume everything is an illusion. Not that it's reasonable to think that, but that it helps a philosopher to balance the mind, to pull it away from this naive trust in the way things are, just in case they might be an illusion. So Locke, he'll go on to say, if you really think it's a dream, why don't you put your finger in a candle? I don't think Descartes... he was saying it's not really a dream. It could be, though. There's no way you could be certain, and I'm looking for certain knowledge. That's what Descartes was saying. What can I know with absolute certainty that no matter how I twist thought experiments in my mind, I can't force myself to think it's not true, and that's, I think, therefore I am. Okay, so John Locke, his big point, I think, in this reading is the idea of secondary qualities and primary qualities, which is Leibniz's well, it's also Berkeley's argument against matter, and that's question 7 for part B for this. So what can we know through our senses? And Locke will say, well, we might smell a violet to smell sweet, and it looks blue, but we can't say that those qualities inhere in the physical object of that flower itself. Whatever particles are emanating or connecting our sense organs with that flower create the sensations of sweet smellingness and blueness in our minds. But that doesn't mean that the flower itself is blue or sweet smelling. But it does have primary qualities, like extension in space and movement, and that's what you have to learn to discern. If you're trying to gain knowledge, you have to discern between the secondary qualities and the primary qualities of the material objects. So I'll actually, to help preview this on page 65 at the bottom, Locke draws a distinction between an object's primary and secondary qualities. The primary qualities are those inseparable from an object, such as its solidity, size, or velocity. The secondary qualities are powers in an object to produce sensations in us, for example, color, taste, and odor. Thus, the solid brown table I see in front of me is in itself solid, but only perceived as brown. So that's the main idea. So on page 67, in the left-hand column, up at the top, to discover the nature of our ideas, the better, and to discourse of them intelligibly, it will be convenient to distinguish them as they are ideas or perceptions in our minds, and as they are modifications of matter in the bodies that cause such perceptions in us, that so we may not think, as perhaps usually is done, that they are exactly the images and resemblances of something inherent in the subject. Okay, so he's leading up to the primary and secondary qualities of matter. A little lower on that column, number 9, qualities thus considered in bodies are, first, such as are utterly inseparable from the body, in what state soever it be, such as in all the alterations and changes it suffers, all the force can be used upon it, it constantly keeps, and such as sense constantly finds in every particle of matter which has bulk enough to be perceived. All right, so solidity, extension, figure, and mobility, that is what inheres as the primary qualities of matter. Solidity, extension, figure, and mobility. You can take an object like a grain of wheat and divide it any number of times you want. Each division of this, any material thing you divide, will have those primary qualities. So these I call original or primary qualities of body, which I think may observe to produce simple ideas: solidity, extension, figure, motion, or rest in number. Secondly, such qualities which in truth are nothing in the objects themselves, but powers to produce various sensations in us by their primary qualities, such as colors, sounds, and tastes, I call secondary qualities. And then a third form of knowledge you need to be aware of is the ability of a material object to change another material object in such a way that it produces different secondary qualities in a human subject. So this is now, he numbers these paragraphs, page 67, paragraph 11. The next thing to be considered is how bodies produce ideas in us, and that is manifestly by impulse, the only way which we can conceive bodies to operate in. So, some motion must thence be continued by our nerves or animal spirits by some parts of our bodies to the brain. All right, so our nerve endings, he's assuming there must be some physical impulse. We have knowledge of material things because of some physical contact between minute particles emanating from an object, or if we hold the object itself, touching the minute particles of our sense organs, which then lead to our brain or the seat of sensation, there to produce in our minds the particular ideas we have of them. So I'll just read, this is page 68. And since the extension, figure, number, and motion of bodies of an observable bigness may be perceived at a distance by the sight, it is evident some singly imperceptible bodies must come from them to the eyes. So we would call that photons today. And thereby convey to the brain some motion which produces these ideas which we have of them in us. So you see an object in the distance, then there must be some singly imperceptible bodies that come from them to the eyes. So light reflects off that object and produces the photon, hits our retina, it hits our optic nerve, it goes to our brain. We see an image of whatever it is. So this whole question is, what can we know and how do we know it? And this is the empiricist view of John Locke. We know things from the imperceptible particles of material objects that exist outside of our mind, contacting our sense organs and communicating their motion to the seat of sensation, such as the brain, he's saying, or whatever it is, whatever physical organ creates the ideas for us to perceive, is caused to act by material particles from the outside world. That's empiricism. So paragraph 13, page 68, after the same manner that the ideas of these original qualities are produced in us, we may conceive that the ideas of secondary qualities are also produced by the operations of insensible particles on our senses. So I could get into more of these details, but that's the main idea that he reiterates a few times. He'll talk on page 69, paragraph 21, explain how water, felt as cold by one hand, may be warm to the other. So he's differentiating the secondary and primary qualities of matter. Heat is not a primary quality of matter. How do you know that? Well, you could put hot water will feel hotter to your hand that's, if it's cold. So put your hand in the freezer for a minute. Now put it in some warm water. That warm water will feel hot to the cold hand. Put your other hand near a lamp and warm it up, and then put it near the warm water, and now it feels cooler. So how is it that the same water can feel hot and cold to different hands? And he's saying, well, if the particles in your hand were going slower because of the cold, and then it touched the faster moving particles of the warm water, it'll feel it as warm. If the particles in your hand are moving more quickly because they're near a source of heat, when you put it in the warm water, it won't be accelerating the particles in your hand. So he's getting into the, this is how he's differentiating secondary qualities such as heat, and he's showing it's relative to the perceiver, and he's also showing that it's all this interaction of minute particles in our body, in our sense organs, and in the physical objects that we perceive. So this is the beginning. Well, it's not the beginning, but this is really a big part of the scientific revolution, the Age of Enlightenment. And this kind of thinking was very powerful. As I'll discuss in future videos, the minute particles that they're talking about become extremely complicated when we introduce quantum physics, in which case the particles exist as little bits of matter when they're being observed or measured, but when they're not being observed, it turns out they behave like mathematical waves of probability for where a particle might appear were it to be observed. Now that's a weird thing, and it's going to be important when we get into the next part of the book for exam 3 about the nature of the body versus the nature of mind. But at any rate, this is an introduction to world philosophy, and in particular, this is an introduction to the modern Age of Enlightenment. So now back on 69, let me reiterate this agreement that John Locke has with Descartes. Of our knowledge of the existence of other things, the knowledge of our own being we have by intuition. The existence of a God, reason clearly makes known to us. The knowledge of the existence of any other thing we can have only by sensation. All right, so he's saying, yes, we can have knowledge of a self without referring to sense impressions on our 5 sense organs. And we can also know about God, just using reason, like the rationalist Rene Descartes said. But everything else, he says, we can only know through sense impressions. So Locke is the beginning of this big push towards empiricism that we're going to see Berkeley take up, and then finally Hume, who takes it to its logical conclusion, after which Immanuel Kant will try to synthesize rationalism and empiricism. And that's all going to be on exam 2. All right, so and then on page 70, he starts to criticize Descartes' questioning about the trustworthiness of our sense perceptions. You know, he's saying, on page 70, the left-hand column, he reiterates that we can know our own self and the existence of God. So I'll read that, and then I'll go on to show how he kind of ridicules people who think we might be living in a dream. All right, so on page 70, the left-hand column, he goes, and of this, the greatest assurance I can possibly have, and to which my faculties can attain, is the testimony of my eyes, which are the proper and sole judges of this thing, whose testimony I have reason to rely on as certain, that I can no more doubt, whilst I write this, that I see white and black, he's looking at his piece of paper, and that something really exists that causes the sensation in me, than that I write or move my hand, which is a certainty as great as human nature is capable of concerning the existence of anything but a man's self alone and of God. So he's saying we have no reason not to trust our senses. And remember, Descartes said the same thing. He goes, it's much more reasonable to trust our senses, but I'm only going to pretend that our sense perceptions are utterly untrustworthy for the philosophical sake of seeking some undoubtable truth. But so then Locke will go on to say, you know, is anyone really so skeptical as to be uncertain of the existence of those things which he sees and feels? He goes, you know, go ahead, put your finger in a flame, and that'll teach you that it's real. Again, that's not what Descartes was saying. And he goes, and if you think this is a big long dream, then your very act of questioning it as a dream is itself a dream. But if you want to ask me, then you can dream up that I answered you this. And now this is where Locke gives up the possibility of absolute and certain knowledge. So Rene Descartes thought we could have, and again, it's not included in our book, but he thought we could have certain knowledge of the way the material world works, because we could have certain knowledge that we exist as a thinking being. We could have, and then he'll go on to say, we could have certain knowledge that God exists as the perfect thinking being, the all-powerful, trustworthy being, and therefore we can trust our sense perceptions of the material world. And it just so happens that the laws of mathematics can be superimposed upon our models of the material world and give us perfect knowledge of the way the material world behaves. This idea that human reason can learn with absolute perfection the nature of the material world. Locke is going to start to question that, saying, well, maybe not. You know, our senses are not perfect, and maybe the human being is not capable of perfect knowledge of the material world. Even though he says, I have good reason to believe there is a material world corresponding to my sense perceptions of it. So on page 70, the right-hand column, he says, but yet, if he pleases, he's talking about skeptics like Descartes, he may dream that I make him this answer, that the certainty of things existing in rerum natura I hope I pronounced that Latin correctly, when we have the testimony of our senses for it, is not only as great as our frame can attain to, but also, but as our condition needs, for our faculties being suited not to the full extent of being, nor to a perfect, clear, comprehensive knowledge of things, free from all doubt and scruple, but to the preservation of us in whom they are, and accommodated to the use of life, they serve to our purpose well enough, if they will but give us certain notice of those things which are convenient or inconvenient to us, such as putting your finger in a candle will cause you great pain. So then I'll go on to say on page 71, so that this evidence is as great as we can desire, being as certain to us as our pleasure or pain, i.e. happiness or misery, beyond which we have no concern either of knowing or being. Okay, that just seems to me not the way I feel about things. I have no concern of knowing anything other than the imperfect knowledge I can gain through my senses. That's good enough because it helps me live. It helps me stay away from burning to death in a fire. If there is such a thing as perfect knowledge, wouldn't you want to have it? And he's saying that, we have no concern of knowing things beyond our survival necessities, our preservation. It's what he seems to be saying here. Okay, so I've gone over, I think, enough of John Locke, and now we're going to move on to Leibniz, who's criticizing Locke. On page 71, and he openly introduces, he starts off by talking about John Locke. So he says, the essay on the understanding, which we just went over, from John Locke, produced by an illustrious Englishman, is one of the finest and most admired works of the age, since I have thought at length about the same subject, and about most of the topics which are dealt with in it, I decided to comment upon it. So, there is the question whether the soul in itself is completely blank, like a writing tablet, on which nothing has yet been written, a tabula rasa, as Aristotle and the author of the essay maintain, meaning Locke, and whether everything which is inscribed there comes solely from the senses and experience, or whether the soul inherently contains the sources of various notions and doctrines which external objects merely rouse up on suitable occasions, as I believe, and as do Plato and even the schoolmen, and all those who understand in this sense the passage in St. Paul, that's from the Bible, where he says that God's law is written on our hearts, Romans 2:15. All right, so tabula rasa. For exam 2 part B, number 5, explain Locke's tabula rasa idea. Knowledge comes from material objects outside our bodies, emanating minute particles that interact with the minute particles of our sense organs, which then are transmitted to our brain, the source of our ideas. And that our mind is a blank slate, and that these sense impressions inscribe knowledge on that blank tablet, like a chalkboard. That's empiricism. The rationalists say our mind is not a blank slate, it's pre-programmed with certain forms of knowledge. That's what Plato definitely said, which is why I said they should have mentioned Plato in this section of the book. For Plato, it's these absolute forms of knowledge. There are many. Anything you can know can be traced back to some absolute eternal form of knowledge, all of which emanate from the ultimate idea of the good. We're going to see this later in the book in Plato's cave allegory. But Leibniz is saying, are we a blank slate? Or, as I believe and as do Plato, is God's law written on our hearts? And so this is a short reading. It's just going to be over on page 72. He goes, that raises another question, namely whether all truths depend on experience, that is, on induction and instances, or if some of them have some other foundation. So in the first part of the book, we went over deduction and induction. For a deductive argument, you can be certain it's true if the premise is true. So you start with a premise. If that premise is true and you have a valid deductive argument, then you can be certain that the conclusion is also true. And but induction is you take a series of examples of a thing, and then you infer, since it's happened this way in the past, it will probably happen the same way in the future. And what Leibniz is pointing out here is you can't have absolute certain knowledge based on induction. Deduction gives absolute certain knowledge. Induction can only give you very probable knowledge. And that's what he says. Empirical observations can only ever give you inductive, you can have inductive reasoning through empirical observations, and that gives you at best very probable knowledge. It can never give you certain knowledge. So if you're an empiricist, he's saying you can't have certain knowledge. We saw, however, John Locke say you can have certain knowledge of your own self, you exist, and you can have certain knowledge of the existence of God. He doesn't get into that in the excerpt that we have. So this is what Leibniz is talking about. So I'll just continue. He says on page 72, for if some events can be foreseen before any test has been made of them, it is obvious that we contribute something from our side. Although the senses are necessary for all our actual knowledge, they are not sufficient to provide it, since they never give us anything but instances, that is, particular or singular truths, but however many instances confirm a general truth, they do not suffice to establish its universal necessity. For it does not follow that what has happened will always happen in the same way. So that's what we talked about when we went over induction. You see that when you put your finger in the flame, every time in the past, it hurts. So you can reason that it's going to hurt if I do it again in the future. And it probably will. But Leibniz is saying, but you can't be absolutely certain that just because it's always worked that way in the past, it must necessarily work that way always in the future. So you can't. You can have very good probable reason, but you can't have absolute certain knowledge through empirical sense experiences. He says, but however many instances confirm a general truth, they do not suffice to establish its universal necessity, for it does not follow that what has happened will always happen in the same way. From this, it appears that necessary truths, such as we find in pure mathematics, and particularly in arithmetic and geometry, must have principles whose proof does not depend on instances, nor consequently on the testimony of the senses, even though without the senses it would never occur to us to think of them. We're going to see that Immanuel Kant uses a lot of the same reasoning. He'll say, we require sense perceptions to get the internal mechanisms of our innate ideas moving, but that doesn't mean that we don't have these innate ideas. We do. Sense impressions awaken them, but they're already there awaiting to be awakened. All right, so Leibniz, I'll just move over to the right-hand column. He says, talking about John Locke, our gifted author seems to claim that there is nothing implicit in us. In fact, nothing of which we are not always actually aware. But he cannot hold strictly to this, otherwise his position would be too paradoxical, since again, we are not always aware of our acquired dispositions or of the contents of our memory, and they do not even come to our aid when we need them, though often they come readily to mind when some idle circumstance reminds us of them, such as when you hear a bit of a song, it helps you remember the whole thing. All right, nothing implicit in us. What Leibniz is talking about here is what we would today call an unconscious mind. He's saying Locke implies that we don't have an unconscious mind. And I paused while I was reading that because I realized I have to go back and look over something that John Locke said. But the idea of an unconscious mind. So there's nothing implicit, there's no innate knowledge, Leibniz is saying to Locke. Well, what about memory itself? Where are memories stored? If there's no self with innate ideas, okay, well then how is it that we have these memories imprinted on the mind? They're not always there. So Locke was saying that if we have innate ideas, we should be aware of them constantly. And Leibniz was saying, well, we have ideas in our memory that we're not always aware of, and yet we have them, so why must we necessarily always be immediately aware of the innate ideas imprinted on the soul. Maybe they're there, but they're just unconscious and they need to be worked on to brought to consciousness. That's what he's saying. And I'll go back and actually, let me go back now just to make sense of that point. On page 66, on the right-hand column, well, it's on the left-hand column. So he's saying some people say we have innate ideas, some universal principles. Paragraph number 2, page 66. General assent, the great argument. There is nothing more commonly taken for granted than that there are certain principles, both speculative and practical, for they speak of both, universally agreed upon by all mankind, which therefore they argue must needs be the constant impressions which the souls of men receive in their first beings, and which they bring into the world with them, as necessarily and really as they do any of their inherent faculties. So, he says, this argument drawn from universal consent has this misfortune in it, that if you could find any other source for those so-called universal truths, then they wouldn't necessarily have to be innate. It might be that everyone agrees there are certain innate truths, but maybe everybody learns them after they're born and just fools themselves into thinking they were born with that innate knowledge. And 2 examples from logic that he's saying, we're born with this knowledge. This is paragraph 4 on page 66. What is, and it is impossible for the same thing to be and not to be. So these are the 2 universal truths that people believe in are logically self-evident. What is, and it is impossible for the same thing to be and not to be. The law of contradiction. If something is, it can't be something else. And then based on that self-evident truth, you can analyze different arguments that people make to see whether they're true or not. This is what Locke is saying is not the case, that isn't universally known. And how do we know that that's not universally known? Because on paragraph 5, and this is not politically correct, he says, not on the mind naturally imprinted, because not known to children, idiots, etc. For first, it is evident that all children and idiots have not the least apprehension or thought of them, the laws of logic, and that want of this is enough to destroy that universal assent, which must needs be the necessary concomitant of all innate truths. It's seeming to me a near contradiction to say that which there are truths imprinted on the soul, which it perceives or understands not. Imprinting, if it signify anything, be nothing else but the making certain truths to be perceived. Saying if we have certain truths imprinted on our soul, they should be self-evident at all times. They're an impression on our soul, like a sense impression. Well, we should be aware of them always. And since we're not, and children and people who he calls idiots, anyone not capable of rational thought does not perceive these ideas. They still have a soul, therefore their souls were not born with this innate knowledge. That's his argument. And that's what we saw Leibniz saying. It seems that John Locke doesn't believe in a subconscious mind, that everything has to be on the surface. But continuing here on page 66, for to imprint anything on the mind without the mind's perceiving it seems to me hardly intelligible. If therefore children and idiots have souls, have minds with those impressions upon them, they must unavoidably perceive them. So there's his argument. No proposition can be said to be in the mind which it never yet knew, which it was never yet conscious of. Okay, and I want to just make sure that this video is still rolling, and it is 1 hour and 3 minutes. Okay, so this is a normal class period in philosophy. We just read the book, the texts, and we analyze the details of it. All right. So going back here to exam 2. All right, so that's what John Locke's empiricist argument is. We don't have innate ideas. If we did, they'd always be perceptible. And what does Leibniz criticize Locke by saying? He says on page 72, our gifted author seems to claim that there is nothing implicit in us. In fact, nothing of which we are not always actually aware. But he cannot hold strictly to this, otherwise his position would be too paradoxical, since again we are not always aware of our acquired dispositions or of the contents of our memory. And they do not even come to our aid when we need them. though often they come readily to mind, when some idle circumstance reminds us of them. So, he's bringing in the idea of an unconscious mind, which is something that we did not see Descartes bring in in the selections that we read, at any rate. I think that actually, if we do go back and see on page 100, on page 102, there is some implication of an unconscious mind. The right-hand paragraph, a right column, bottom paragraph, he says, he goes, "This is a considerable list. If everything on it belongs to me, so what am I?" He says, "I'm a thinking thing. But is it not one and the same I who is now doubting almost everything, who nonetheless understands some things, who affirms that this one thing is true, denies everything else, desires to know more, is unwilling to be deceived, imagines many things even involuntarily, and is aware of many things which apparently come from the senses? Are not all these things just as true as the fact that I exist, even if I am asleep all the time, and even if he who creates me is doing all he can to deceive me?" So imagines many things involuntarily. When he brings up that involuntary imagination, that's also a reference to the unconscious mind. So if we have innate ideas, John Locke is saying, then we should be aware of them constantly. Leibniz is saying you can't hold to that belief consistently, because what about the fact of memories? We don't have them all the time in front of our mind. They come and they go, but they must be stored somewhere. And if our memories are stored somewhere, maybe other things are stored in our minds also, like innate ideas imprinted on the soul. So continuing on page 72, "And furthermore, why must we acquire everything through awareness of outer things and not be able to unearth anything from within ourselves? Is our soul in itself so empty that unless it borrows images from outside, it is nothing? Besides, there are hundreds of indications leading us to conclude that at every moment there is in us an infinity of perceptions, unaccompanied by awareness or reflection, that is, of alterations in the soul itself, of which we are unaware, because these impressions are either too minute and too numerous, or else too unvarying so that they are not sufficiently distinctive on their own. But when they are combined with others, they do nevertheless have their effect and make themselves felt, at least confusedly, within the whole." All right, so what I think, now going back to these exam questions. Exam 2, Part A, Question 1. What are the similarities and differences between the rationalist views of knowledge put forth by Descartes and Leibniz? Which position is better argued by and explained? So there's no, if you think one of the, Leibniz, his position is better argued, or Descartes, which one you think is better argued, I can't say you're right or you're wrong, but I can just grade you on how you explain your position. And to do that, just refer to the book. If that's the main thing I'm looking for. Did you read the text? And did you think about it while you were answering the question? That is the main thing that I'm looking for. So, similarities and differences. There wasn't a lot to work with. We had about 1 page for Leibniz. The similarities are that they both think that human reason can give us knowledge, that we do not depend for all of our knowledge on sense perceptions, that there are certain truths that human reason can discern without reference to any sense perceptions. And even that, it gets complicated, because Leibniz says that, the sense perceptions awaken the need to refer to these innate truths. But so the main point is Descartes and Leibniz both believe that human reason can give us certain absolute knowledge. Now, we didn't get enough into Leibniz, where he talked about his proof for the existence of God, and his idea of, everything, like Descartes, everything has to have a cause. Well, what could have caused this idea of this perfect being? Humans have an idea of a perfect, all-powerful being. It's called God. Do all humans have this idea? They're assuming that all humans do have this idea. The idea must have been caused by something. Since there's nothing in the material world that's perfect and all-powerful, that idea must have been caused by something that actually is perfect and all-powerful. I'd say the main difference between them is that Leibniz focuses on the possibility of this unconscious mind, this implicit knowledge that we're not always aware of. Descartes makes a brief reference to it, it seems to me, on page 102. But so the similarities and differences, the main point is just explain what Descartes' basic arguments were in Leibniz. And with Descartes, refer not only to pages in part 3 of the book, but also to the section starting on page 100. So that'll give you a little bit more. That's part 4 of the book. All right, now for part B, what is empiricism? This is questions 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. What is empiricism? What is rationalism? What is idealism? What is skepticism? Explain Locke's tabula rasa idea. Explain Leibniz's criticism of Locke. Empiricism, in a nutshell, knowledge comes from sense perceptions, from your sense organs. Rationalism, there are certain forms of knowledge that reason can acquire without the help of the senses. Innate knowledge. For Descartes, the idea of God is innate, but that we didn't touch on that in our book. But the thing that we do touch on, starting on page 100, is reason can realize that that the self exists because the act of thinking requires that you exist. You can't think if you don't exist. Even if you doubt everything, doubting is a form of thinking. To think is to exist. That's Descartes' famous rationalism. What is idealism? We'll get into that when we cover Berkeley. He says, just briefly, he says, yes, I'm an empiricist, I agree, everything comes from our sense perceptions, but what are sense perceptions but ideas in the mind? All that exists are ideas in the minds that perceive them. That's idealism. What is skepticism? Skepticism is doubting the idea that we can't know things, that, Rene Descartes started with total skepticism. I'm going to doubt everything I possibly can until I find something that's impossible to doubt. The one thing that's impossible to doubt is the fact that I'm doubting. I must exist in order to doubt. So we'll touch on those again as we go over the other readings in this part of the book. So number 5, part B, explain Locke's tabula rasa idea. Our soul is born a blank slate. The sense impressions, which are minute particles emanating from material objects that we see, or if we touch the material object itself, then touching the primary qualities of these material objects excites the minute particles of our sense organs, which are connected through our nerve endings to our brain to create the ideas that we experience of the world, the secondary qualities of matter. The colors and the tastes and the sounds, those are not inherent in the material object, but the material object excites those ideas in our minds through this physical imprinting of the minute particles of our bodies and the objects that we perceive. That's the tabula rasa idea. The mind is being written on by these sense impressions. Explain Leibniz's criticisms of Locke. His main criticism is that Locke has no idea of implicit knowledge, or what we would call an unconscious mind. That Locke says, if we have innate ideas, then they should be obviously known to every person with a soul. Children and idiots, he'll say, or just people who don't have rational powers. They don't know certain innate truths, such as a thing cannot be and not be at the same time. The laws of logic are not apparent to them. They don't make any sense to children. So there must not be these truths must not be imprinted on their souls, or they'd be aware of them. And Leibniz is saying, no, we have we have memories that we're not always aware of. You can try to remember something, and then no matter how hard you try, it doesn't come. And then out of nowhere, it pops into your mind. Well, where was that memory? It was in your mind. Just like innate ideas can be in your mind without you being totally aware of them. So that I think will cover those questions, and in the next video we're going to compare Locke, Berkeley, and Hume.